We're not big fans of surveillance. I wish we didn't need it. But the fact is, when crime happens, they do help solve crime. So I am in support of it, and I do want to continue that. I want those cameras in Soto turned on. I want the cameras on Capitol Hill installed and being utilized.
That's Seattle City Council member Maritza Rivera speaking to me on Seattle Channel just a few days ago, voicing her support for surveillance cameras. But she also heard some loud voices this week from a group called Community Not Cameras, saying that this technology can be very dangerous, especially when it comes to protecting one's identity. Cameras, public safety, all very much in the public eye here in Seattle this week, especially in the wake of the Bite of Seattle shooting. Brian Callanan here with you. I'm a host on the Seattle Channel. The views expressed here are mine. And I'm going to try something a little bit different here on Seattle News, Views and Brews, your coffee break political podcast. We're going to hear from Community Not Cameras for the first half of the show. Then Councilmember Bob Kettle, a staunch supporter of surveillance technology, for the second half and get you some different perspectives on that. So I'll start off by offering a big thanks to Camille Baldwin-Bonney of Community Not Cameras for joining me. Camille, really appreciate you being on the show.
Thank you. My pleasure to be here.
Thanks also to our background noise sponsor, City Grind Espresso on the first floor of City Hall. You can become a patron of the show on Patreon. Giving levels start at just $5 a month. You get access to Patrons First podcast. You get a cool decal like this. So please head to Patreon, become a paying member. Thanks also to Converge Media. The video version of the program is on Converge each week, and we appreciate their support. All right, let's get the conversation going. Time for Right Here, Right Now. So, Camille, just recapping the past few days, Community Not Cameras took a tour of Seattle's real-time crime center. This is the data network that looks at dozens of closed-circuit TV cameras all around the city, combines them with 911 data. The RTCC has been online since May of 2025. Police say the center helps staff give out information as incidents occur and helps officers in the field. But I want to make sure I talk about this. What did Community Not Cameras see that was a big concern and maybe should concern others?
Yeah, well, I think what we saw in the tour was that our concerns were not only, we weren't relieved by the tour, but they were amplified. During the tour, there was somebody had automatically logged in, and we learned there's no automatic log out. That's a major concern. But we also learned that we don't have control over this data. It's really Axon, the company that sells the data, or that sells the surveillance rather, that has control. And they can feed that data into their cloud-based system at any point. They can do it without SPD even knowing about it. So, all these quote-unquote protections that are in place are really policy, but policy can easily be violated, and we have no way of knowing whether or not that's happening. What happens if a federal agent contacts Axon and asks for the data? There's no reason to think that wouldn't happen. And yeah, it's frightening.
Thank you for that. I did want to dive into this point that you're bringing up with regard to the safeguards that the city has in place. So I've reported a lot on this. Most recently, the city updated its ordinance on this back in March. The city council did. There's this maximum retention period of this video evidence for 30 days, but if the footage hasn't been flagged for a crime, it's stored for 5 days. SPD says more than 95% of its video records are permanently deleted within this 5-day window. The footage is only moved to permanent cloud storage if it's actively flagged as evidence for a specific criminal investigation. I just wanted to put that out there. That's what the ordinance says for the city here. And I guess my question to you is, are those safeguards not strong enough?
No, they're not. I mean, we don't have any way to enforce them. Again, ultimately Axon owns that data, and we're just relying on them to, follow our city laws. There's no repercussions if they don't, and we have no way of knowing. So it's, as one of the members of our tour said after viewing it, it's a Swiss cheese system. It's not secure, and we can't enforce the safeguards that we supposedly have in place.
And can you point to a situation where Axon data has been accessed in a way that would be a concern to other people in our state and other states? Do you have some stories, some anecdotes, some data about that you can share?
I don't have specific knowledge of it. I don't know that we would know. What I can say, though, is that we do know that, for example, the Department of Licensing data is being accessed by ICE and Customs and Border Control. And this is despite, policy in place that says they're not allowed to access it. It is happening, and it is being used to abduct our community members. And there's just no reason to think that ICE or Customs and Border Control wouldn't also attempt to access surveillance in Seattle.
I hear what you're saying. That has been a big concern in our state. And I know that if the feds want to subpoena video information from the city of Seattle, it's going to happen. They're going to be able to get that information. That is definitely a concern that I've heard from the city council on this issue. But I did want to make sure I brought up this piece with you if I could. So on the same day as the press conference this week, the Seattle Metro Chamber of Commerce released the results of an online survey it took of 500 registered voters in Seattle, and the polling showed 75% of those respondents said they strongly or somewhat supported using cameras to assist in an active investigation after a 911 call. I guess I'm just trying to figure out your message to those voters, or maybe some of the communities in Southeast Seattle who've really spoken out about this and want more of these surveillance cameras. What do you want to say to them?
Yeah, well, thank you for bringing that up. And I have a number of things that I would like to say in response. One is that we are incredibly concerned about public safety. This is why we're here. And we are concerned about the safety risks that these cameras present to community. But, you brought up the survey and the support of the cameras. The survey question was worded in a way that made a lot of false promises about what the cameras can do, and also mischaracterized the opposition to the cameras as well. So, when you word a question promising that something can deliver in a way that it can't, of course people are going to respond in favor. These cameras do not reduce violent crime. They don't stop things from happening. Cameras don't stop bullets. That just simply does not happen. It also doesn't improve crime clearance rates. And there's a 40-year study that SPD used in its justification of pursuit of the system. That study doesn't back up use of the surveillance cameras. It over 40 years, it says, in studying these surveillance cameras, says didn't show an investigatory benefit. And the research on real-time crime centers is even thinner, but the report that SPD relied on in its surveillance impact report showed a very small 5% increase in clearance rates. However, there's some study out of Milwaukee that showed no difference whatsoever. Atlanta, Georgia, which has a massive surveillance system and real-time crime center, also run by Axon, has not, despite that massive surveillance, has not shown an increase in crime clearance rates. So what I would say to those community members is we are very concerned about violence in our communities. And this is exactly why we are asking City Council to redirect funds from surveillance towards community violence prevention, because we do need to prevent violence in our community. And we want the City Council to direct funds to the things that actually accomplish that goal.
Thank you for bringing that up. I know that the City Council has been talking about this over the past week as well. Council President Joy Hollingsworth redirecting about $250,000, money that was set aside for some of this surveillance camera work and installing these surveillance cameras, and putting it towards community violence interrupters. If you'd like to learn more about that, folks, make sure you check out the show on Seattle Channel, City Inside Out Council Edition, a good discussion about that. But Camille, I need to start wrapping up with you if I could. I really appreciate the conversation here. So just looking forward here, the mayor has asked for an audit of Seattle's surveillance camera system to be conducted by New York University University. You know about this. They're going to be looking at some privacy, some of these civil rights issues you're talking about. There's also an evaluation going on from Seattle's Office of the Inspector General. This involves a University of Pennsylvania group that's focused on evaluating crimes, how cameras are affecting outcomes of investigations. I guess my big question is, will you be satisfied once those reports come in that the city has studied the concerns you're bringing up sufficiently? I'm just trying to talk about that and what's ahead for Community Not Cameras. I get the feeling you're not going away.
We sure aren't. We'll be looking at what those results are of those studies closely. We're very interested to find out as well. I think we have some concerns that they're really going to adequately address the concerns that we have. We have some concerns about how well they know the Washington state laws, and particularly the Keep Washington Working Act and the SHIELD law. So we will be looking at that. I think we also have concerns about whether or not they're really evaluating on the terms that the cameras were presented or the surveillance were presented. The surveillance impact report said that these interventions were to reduce violent crime. The evidence is overwhelming that they don't do that. And so I think that these studies really need to address that and look at, are they reducing violent crime? I mean, there's no reason to think they would. We have decades worth of research to say it doesn't do that. But we also think it's really important if you're going to study the results, we need to know that they are doing what they said they are going to do, in addition to the other safety risks that we and concerns that we have about the cameras.
All right. I really appreciate this full discussion here. Again, Camille Baldwin-Bonney of Community Not Cameras, I really appreciate you being with me.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you. And coming up next, it's Councilmember Bob Kettle of the Seattle City Council, very much a supporter of these cameras and this type of technology. We're going to hear what he has to say coming up next. Well, Seattle News Views and Brews continues its spotlight on surveillance with a new guest. Let me bring him in here, Councilmember Bob Kettle from the Seattle City Council. Councilmember Kettle, thank you for working this time into your schedule. I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you, Brian. I really appreciate the opportunity to come back on Seattle News Views and Brews. It's great.
You got it. All right. There's a lot more ahead here. I want to get your reaction to what Community Not Cameras has been saying about surveillance cameras in Seattle this week. Here's a clip from their press conference on Monday.
The SPD ALPR cameras are currently turned off, and they need to remain that way. Their use amounts to continuous, warrantless searches that violate civil liberties and endanger people. This technology has not been proven to improve public safety. Instead, it is causing very real harm daily.
So that's Kathleen Carson talking about the SPD's automated license plate readers, ALPR there, and her concerns. And I know, Councilmember Kettle, you've heard these types of concerns before, but I want to break this down with you. In the first half of the show, I brought up some of the guardrails that you helped put in place for the city back in March of this year, the ordinance which limits the retention time for this video, along with some other safeguards. But these critics I'm hearing from are saying that the safeguards are not enough. We don't know what software companies like Axon are doing with this data when it's recorded. I want to make sure that you respond to that.
Brian, there's a lot of discussion, and unfortunately, it's not usually grounded with some of the facts. So, for example, somebody can say what they said, but I know, working with PD, Seattle Police Department on issues, the value of ALPR, which is currently on hold because of the state law changes, but also with CCTV, we saw it again and again and again in different instances where it really made a difference in terms of identifying who was, committing the crime and so forth. But here's the thing too, is like when you hear the press conference and people make different points, these points are not necessarily correct. So for example, the CCTV cameras, the images stay on the camera and they're for 5 days and they're overwritten. And then it's only when there's a queuing, like from a 911 call, will then the real-time crime center go out to that camera and pull it off. And then it's being pulled off as part of a crime, part of a situation, which then, like every other piece of evidence, will go into the evidence system, if you will. Mm-hmm. And so this idea that Axon is having those, that image that's just sitting on there for 5 days is not right. That's the challenge that we have right now. And when you combine that fact regarding CCTV and the fact that ALPR is currently down because of basically we have to get in sync with the state law.
Yeah.
really, there's not a lot going to Axon at the moment.
Yeah, it's important to point that out. And I know I brought it up with you before. Like, let's say there's a subpoena or something like that. Like the feds come in and say, hey, we want to see that data. That doesn't go to Axon. That goes through the city, right? Can you help clear up that piece? Because I think a lot of people see Axon as this, well, I guess, clearinghouse of data and video and things like that. But that really is the property of the city. Can you help me clear up that point?
Yes. And this one of the things, and by the way, I said this last week. I met with the NYU Law Policing Project, which is doing the audit on behalf of Mayor Wilson. And we spoke through all these different pieces, making these points that we had. And I went through the different areas. And so like on the contract language, we were very specific in terms of how the contract language would read to protect the city, to build in those safeguards, those guardrails, like you mentioned earlier. And that related to, of course, subpoenas. Brian, can I say as well, I recognize these individuals, these groups are concerned about like a surveillance state and so forth.
Yeah.
But as I said to the group from NYU, I understand. I spent the better part of a quarter century in the intelligence community. I recognize and understand the concerns. And then I have concerns now about how much money is being pumped into ICE and other parts of federal law enforcement because they're developing new tools. And so I recognize that point. But because of that experience and working with my colleagues on the council, we built in a lot of these different guardrails, and they show up in different ways. They show up in the contract language, but then they show up in the parameters in terms of the systems as they are working in terms of operationally. And then we put things in like, and I mentioned this point because one of the issues that we had around different jurisdictions is an officer taking some information, walking out of the building with it, going down the street and handing it over to ICE. And I said to the NYU group, this is the insider threat issue. So that's why the Real-Time Crime Center, where this information goes to, it doesn't go anywhere else, it goes to the Real-Time Crime Center. There's only one sworn officer, and he's Lieutenant Raguso now, who runs the Real-Time Crime Center, formerly Captain Britt. We built in things like that as well, for that very reason. So we walk through these different things, again, informed by my colleagues in terms of their legal expertise or mine in terms of the intelligence community. So these are things that we're looking to build in.
Thank you very much for that. I want to talk about something that came out last month. The University of Washington Center for Human Rights put out a report saying federal immigration agents have continued accessing Washington drivers' information through a national law enforcement data sharing system. They made 58 arrests, according to a report from Fox 13, and those arrests are happening despite the state laws that are in place, like Keep Washington Working, which is intended to limit cooperation with civil immigration enforcement. I guess the question I get from that is, even with the safeguards that Seattle has in place, are you concerned that federal officials can and will get around that?
So you've highlighted, one of the big vulnerabilities that we have, and it is the state DOL, the Department of Licensing system that they had. And they put in different fixes, if you will, and parameters. But then if the federal government is coming in on a slightly different angle on that licensing database, then that creates problems. And that's what's driving, what we're seeing, I think, for the most part, because that is a vulnerability. And they have the immediate access,
right,
where it's opened up to the system, if you will. That is a big thing. And it's coupled with the fact that the federal government, federal law enforcement can operate throughout the country, in every state, in every county, in every city. And this is the things that we talked about. And so when we did our 7 bills related to federal law enforcement, public safety bills, most of it in my committee, but not just. We're on Councilmember Rink's select committee on the federal government and so forth. We had some others. We built in some of these pieces in terms of strengthening our parameters, but also mindful, like the wearing of the mask by officers. Ours was a resolution that said, this is the standard that we set in Seattle, and this is what we expect from all officers operating in our jurisdiction. We didn't go down the route like the state did to say, hey, this is against the law, because in a lot of ways it's performative, because the state's not going to be able to enforce that law against federal law enforcement. And so instead of going down that route, we did ours a little bit differently, kind of showing that, here's the standard, and, hey, federal government and federal law enforcement, hey, come here and meet the standard.
Yeah. I want to make sure that I get into another point of contention from critics of surveillance in Seattle. They're saying these cameras don't prevent crime. They don't have much of an impact on solving crime either in other states around the country. I know you've got some, I can see you shaking your head there. You have some things that you've been looking at here. You've been talking with SPD about this. Do you have some information that would prove the contrary?
Yeah, well, you know what can prove the contrary is talking to the King County prosecuting attorney officer, because when they come into the the criminal justice system, and they come in with these images that show, that lead to an arrest of a person who was part of the assault on a 77-year-old downtown. These are what happens. And then again, in my conversation with NYU, I noted, and this is something that we need to understand in terms of preventing crime, is that if you have 100 instances of crime, it is not 100 different people doing one instance of crime. What you may have is 10 people who do 10 instances of crime. And so if you're capturing this person, and by the way, this evidence, which is the camera systems, for example, helps with the convictions. Again, talk to the King County prosecuting attorney, and then that person is in jail. So if that person is only on crime number 2 out of 10, using that as a academic exercise here, then you're preventing that crime, because once this happens, and everybody knows this is standard. Even NYU came back, said yes, and they had a term for it. So we can prevent crime. Now, is it kind of some broad thing? But over time, it does help provide that even more so. But it really goes to, and by the way, this is pillar 2 in our strategic framework plan, a functional criminal justice system. There's a clearance rate on our murders, on the homicides, right? That's very strong in our city compared to national average. Getting the prosecution on these other felony crimes that involve, that we're capturing on the CCTV, for example, and then that really helps the King County prosecutor. So it's about having a functional criminal justice system which does prevent crime, particularly over the long term, because it creates this environment, but it also aids in the prosecution of those that have been arrested for crimes already committed. Which, by the way, is nothing to sneeze about. The people tend to dismiss these things, and it's really quite amazing.
All right. Thank you for that. I want to make sure we talk about coming up, looking a few weeks into the future as more information about surveillance cameras starts coming into Seattle. We've been talking about this NYU report. A lot more with Councilmember Kettle just ahead on What's Next. Councilmember Kettle, starting to wrap up here, I brought up with my previous guest that both the mayor's office and the office of the inspector general are studying Seattle's camera system to figure out how effective it is at solving crime and its impact on privacy concerns. The KUOW reported we might see reports on these two fronts by September next month. Does that sound about right to you? And I guess I wanted to ask that and what you see coming out of these reports. I wanted to make sure I asked the same question of you that I asked of Community Not Cameras.
This is another example, Brian. Thank you for asking, because you read different things in articles or on the radio and so forth, and sometimes things get conflated. When you talk about the OIG, you're talking about UPenn, and the UPenn studies are due at the end of the year, at the end of 26 and the end of 27. So there's that block. So that's different. And then separately is the NYU Law Policing Projects audit, which is what Mayor Wilson has called for. And my hope was for September, but my understanding is it's going to be sometime in October.
I see. Okay. All right. That could stretch a little bit. I guess just looking at that, maybe some expectations about what you're going to see out of those reports. I know that's sometimes dangerous with some of these academic exercises, but I did want to talk about that, and I guess where you see this program going by the end of the year.
Well, again, we've taken the lessons learned. We've taken the experiences to build in the various parameters, the protocols, the contract language, all these different pieces. And I've argued and I've said that I believe that we have the best system in the state. But by the way, another thing that shows up in the news, we don't have the Flock ALPR system,
right,
which was very vulnerable. We did not have that. Again, we did things differently. And because of that attention to detail and building in those safeguards to balance out what we're trying to do on public safety with rights of privacy and civil liberties, I understand that. And that's why we built in these pieces. And so we have the best in the state, no doubt. I would argue that we probably have one of the better systems in terms of that balance between public safety plus privacy and civil liberties in the country. And so I look forward to the NYU report, which is apparently coming in October. And again, I spoke with them for an hour last week, walking through the different things, why we're doing what we're doing. Like, for example, we do not have facial recognition on our CCTV cameras. That was purposely made decision. And so it was important as the person who's quarterbacked these bills to speak to the audit, the authors of the audit, and say, hey, we did this purposely, not to have facial recognition. That's important. To have things just sitting on the camera, not looking to expand it, and to have everything go to the Real-Time Crime Center. That point about insider threat, that was done, and it was done purposely. And that was the things that, that I said in my interview with the NYU team, because it's important to understand the rationale behind the decisions related to our tech, I call tech program, which includes the Crime Center CCTV and the automatic license plate reader system.
I want to make sure that I'm looking closely at equal time for both sides here. So I do need to wrap up with you, and maybe I can switch gears ever so slightly, Councilmember Kettle. Is there anything else coming down the pike as leader of the Public Safety Committee on the council that people should be looking out for here? I know it's a bit of an unsettled time for public safety, especially after the Bite of Seattle shooting. I just wanted to ask you while I had you.
Well, 3 areas. One is we're looking at RVs, which is an issue because, as I say always, if you have 5 RVs, that one's going to start dealing drugs, and once you have a drug market, you have a stolen goods market, and so forth. And that's a challenge that we have.
Yep.
2 is gun violence. This builds up on the Bite of Seattle and the through lines to other instances that we've had in the city. We have to work the gangs issue or the groups with beefs, the young people, all these different pieces, and we have to look at for new solutions and bring back what we've had in the past. Part of this is SPD staffing. We used to have staff gang units, so these are the challenges that we had there. And then the third piece, and this was in my letter to the mayor related to the Bite of Seattle, is that we have to have a public safety security review of our major venues. Not just Seattle Center, but across the board, where we have major events, where we bring a lot of people together. And this is a different calculus than like the CCTV program, which is based on crime data. It's due to the unique pieces of a major venue and the fact that you bring a lot of people, it's a different dynamic. And that's another area that I want to work. And that could create a new set of camera program that's not the CCTV program that's based on crime data, but maybe something, a hybrid between that and like our SDOT transportation cameras, for example. And I think we need to do these 3 areas, for example, to move forward in public safety.
I really appreciate you talking about that road ahead here and what's coming up down the pike here. Councilmember Bob Kettle, really appreciate you taking the time.
Always, I love, and as they say, I'm still a long-time listener of Seattle News, Views, and Brews.
A long-time listener and an often a contributor as well. Thank you so much, Councilmember Kettle. Thanks to everybody listening to Seattle News, Views, and Brews, where you can always find out what's brewing in local politics. Become a patron, please. Check out Seattle News, Views, and Brews on Patreon. Pledge $5 a month or more. Thanks for the help. Great to have you listening to the podcast on Apple, Overcast, Spotify, wherever you're tuning in. Thanks for watching on Converge Media. A quick note, the show is going to take a 2-week respite as the Seattle City Council takes its 2-week summer break. I'll be back with more news coming up in September. See you soon.
Seattle News, Views, and Brews is an independent production of Callanan Media Services. Copyright 2026.